never give up. I never give up. I never give up.
Welcome back to Neff Inspiration, my show on YouTube and as a podcast with me, your host, Stephan Neff. Today is a wonderful day because I have again the honor of talking to Mukesh Kapila. Mukesh is a man who has spent his life in the humanitarian world and has been linked with any number of international institutions, including the WHO, including many other institutions that try to make this world truly a better place. And he has done so for decades. And therefore, he is in such a prime situation now, in such a prime place to talk to me about what is happening right now, i.e. the war in Palestine, the war between Hamas specifically and Israel, and of course all the factors and factions that are coming from all sides and are fomenting shit stirring in there, because it's not just two groups of people, it's so much more. So Mukesh, thank you so much for coming to my show and bringing your unique lens from the humanitarian community and also the WHO to look at the current events in the Middle East.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Stephan.
Thank you. My goodness. I mean, it is Hamas has invaded or has started the war, but this is nothing new. Hamas has been around since the 70s. And in fact, Hamas was actually at one stage supported by Israel because they saw Hamas as the lesser evil compared with PLO and compared with Fatah and other organizations, other maybe terrorist groups, if you want to call them like that. So it's an incredibly confused picture there, isn't it? Were you surprised when Hamas took that action of invading Israel?
It is a complex situation, but on the other hand, I think it has been complexified. But to answer your question more directly about was I surprised? I was surprised that the Hamas assault on Israel took the form it did. It was far more sophisticated and far more organized than I think those guys have been given credit for in the past. And that, of course, took Israel by surprise. Israel has become complacent in recent years, admittedly, but nevertheless, it was a surprise both to Israel and to the rest of the world. So I think that the shock aspect of that has a lot to do with the subsequent reaction. It's what happens when a sudden trauma strikes someone, and the way they react then is very different from when perhaps there is a build-up and the victim or the other side or the opponent has a time to even prepare and calibrate the response. But this was such a psychological and physical shock. And that, I think, set the train in motion in terms of all the events that are so familiar to us in the last few days.
And that is a very good point you're making there. Netanyahu and other the other leaders of Israel have been trying to manage somehow Hamas, manage the problem rather than eradicate it in the past. Now, when I say manage, if you had a closer look into Gaza or some of the other parts of the occupied lands there, you've got unemployment of 50%. You have got people just living on the bare minimum of what can we have. There's no employment. There's no proper education. If you read about the people who have become, for example, Hamas leaders, some of them were students. For example, one of the first big bomb makers in Hamas was actually an engineering student, and he wanted to go overseas. He wanted to study overseas, and Israel said, no, they don't allow you that. And he got so pissed off that he actually used his engineering knowledge and became a bomb maker. So it's those kind of situations where really we have to say, wow, did Israel not actually cause this attack on its own soil?
Well, this particular attack was heinous. Mm-hmm. I think nothing justifies it. And whatever just cause Palestine has, and it does have a just cause, it kind of cancelled it. Not Palestine didn't cancel it, but Hamas cancelled it on that fateful day. And sullied what would be, I think, a just cause. But going back to your point about poverty and the deprivation of Palestine, absolutely. But it's more than that. It just reminds me of a few years ago, I was in Palestine visiting the West Bank, and an Israeli friend with an Israeli car with Israeli number plates took me across the border into Ramallah, into the West Bank, and no problem, just crossed the border. Wandered around, had a cup of coffee, and saw what was going on, and drove back. I hadn't even realized we had crossed the border between Israel and the West Bank. Mm. So I was saying, what's all this fuss about, these Palestinians complaining? And then I explained to me, and then I saw for myself the queue that was waiting. Those who were Palestinians. I was a foreigner. I was with an Israeli. And for me, it was absolutely no problem. But for the Palestinians who were queuing there, old, young, people coming into Israel to work, people going back, people with the little bundles of possessions, with their identity cards on an extremely hot day. And the way the Israeli soldiers were treating them. And these were people of all ages, pregnant mothers, old men and women, people hobbling to and from hospital in Israel, queuing in the dust and looked at with as if they were alien objects by the Israeli security forces on the border, and subjected to a degree of really humiliation for the privilege of crossing that line. Now, in a moment, I understood that it isn't just poverty or economic deprivation. It is a humiliation that accompanies that kind of treatment. That honestly, if I was Palestinian, my blood would boil equally. And then you speak to people and you become sensitized, and you talk to people's experiences, and you realize that when you are carrying that sort of humiliation year after year, decade after decade, then it somehow penetrates your DNA. And as I discovered, I was visiting a Palestinian camp in Lebanon, actually, and there are many Palestinian refugees who have been there since 1948 in Lebanon, and there are many camps in and around Beirut and further. And I was visiting them with the UN Relief Works Organization, UNRWA, which is responsible for their well-being. And I met this young lady who was an occupational therapist, actually. Originally, her grandfather came to Lebanon in 1948, and she thought herself as a refugee, and it kind of took me back, because in my experience, a refugee is a person who has fled conflict and so on, and then the children. I never thought that the children, let alone their grandchildren, were displaced, dispossessed, and refugees. So it's almost as if the act of dispossession is transmitted down the generations. And it's very important to understand that. It is not a generational thing. It's an intergenerational
Absolutely.
thing. And it really gets into your bones and, as I was saying, into your genes. So when you combine all of that, you begin to understand that this is the psychological trauma that simple political solutions will not necessarily overcome. Having said all of that, Hamas is no friend of Palestinians. And from my talking to Palestinians, it's very clear that while many Palestinians sympathize with a struggle to gain their own self-determination, their independence, if you wish, as a Palestine state, which has already been agreed by the United Nations. But Hamas has got more complex agendas than that. And it is in their wider Islamic terrorist mindset. I don't think they care much about Palestine. What they care about is some other superhuman idea akin to ISIS, akin to Islamic State, to create something that is much greater than the identity of individual states, even if they're Muslim states. So we should not make the mistake of confusing Hamas with Palestine. Unfortunately, that has happened. Even Palestinians made that confusion, and Israel as well. And that's why we are in the mess that we are in now.
And it's lovely how you put that, because indeed, Hamas is a group that has fermented within the occupied areas by Israel, but it is by far representative of the Palestinians, shall I say, or the Palestinian cause. It has been labeled a terrorist organization by a number of countries. And I guess the truth lies in the pudding when you look at how Hamas has situated itself close to or within hospitals, within places that are densely populated, and very much therefore accepting this human shield of, well, okay, they are dispensable. If we get attacked, well, we can make currency, we get currency from all the death that is inevitably occurring. That's exactly what we are seeing now. Hamas has forever used ambulances to actually get their leaders around. So we are seeing some very nasty behaviors that are not really in the interest of Palestinians. So I think that states that very clearly.
Well, unfortunately, one of the issues has been that Gaza is extremely densely populated. It's one of the most densely populated spots on Earth.
Yeah.
So once you get Hamas installed there aren't that many places that they can go. There's no kind of vast lands, unoccupied lands. So they have infiltrated, underground, in the built environment, and they are a classic illustration of the face of modern warfare. So we've seen this, for example, in Ukraine at the moment, where the Russians are bombing Ukrainian cities. And we've seen it in many other conflicts around the world, because nobody actually fights over empty ground. Today's conflicts are highly urbanized. So when we combine the Hamas mindset with the geographical setting where they are found, then you have the most toxic combination that you can possibly imagine. And when the rules of war were written, when people thought of these matters in easier times, perhaps, I don't know whether easier or not really, but everything in the past was supposed to be better off, but people say. But, I don't think people imagined the context in which we would be fighting today's wars: urban, high intensity, modern weaponry of great killing power. And a combination of all of that, I think we are seeing the full expression of that now in Gaza.
You were pointing earlier in one of your first sentences, you were pointing out the sophistication of Hamas attacks. And I agree. That sophistication is not some teenagers welding some rockets together somewhere underground. This is very clearly has been financed and supported by other states, and there's the suggestion that Iran has been very fundamental in supplying Hamas and maybe other groups with weaponry. What is your take on that? I mean, is that really a conflict of Israel versus Hamas, or are we not talking about a much wider conflict in the Middle East, where in the shadows other people are pulling the strings, other states, shall I say?
I think it's certain that Hamas has been financed from outside, and that includes Iran. And over the decades, they built up both the sophisticated technical knowledge as well as the means, capital, if you wish, to construct their underground tunnels and all the other command and control arrangements, systems, and such like. And all that takes, by the way, a lot of money. So that's so now. Your point about is this just a war between those two entities, or is there something else at play? Well, today's conflicts are never between A and B.
Okay, good point.
I think because we live in a globalized world where both the means for making war and the finance to run it and the skills and knowledge are widespread, and they are exported and imported. And you'll find in every conflict around the world, there are stakeholders. And in this case, of course, we've got a lot of stakeholders. We have basically the Western powers who are by and large pro-Israel. And then we have the Arab states who have an ambivalent relationship to Palestine. They're not all pro-Palestine, as sometimes you automatically imagine they are. But nevertheless, they're sympathetic to it for reasons that are not necessarily benign reasons. We can come back to that. And then, of course, there are third parties who are always willing to make mischief and spread confusion and chaos elsewhere. So, but then, you have to ask yourself, why are people so stupid as to allow themselves to be manipulated that way? It must be because it benefits them or because they're desperate. So I think all those factors are there to play. And let's not forget the diaspora. I mean, what strikes me in the current conflict is that it's not just being fought in Gaza or between Israeli troops and Israeli aeroplanes, but it's being fought between the diasporas or on social media, on street demonstrations, and so on. And you see that every day. I was just watching on television this evening, the big demonstrations in London, in Berlin, in Paris, and then last week when I was in Istanbul, it was going on there also. So, and that's the face of modern war as well. All the warriors of this war are not just at the front lines. They are basically behind computer screens, and they are firing off their disinformation and other means of waging war, which means that it's a very simplistic picture to say that the wars are, and this war is being fought between combatants. It's basically being fought by two camps, or maybe more than two camps, and they're spread globally.
And I think that is well said. And that, you could argue, for example, well, why does the WHO not grow some balls and some teeth and goes in there and sorts things out? For all those factors that you have just mentioned, it's not so easy. There is so much more going on, and therefore it is kind of.
Well, I think coming to that, just sorry to interrupt you. It's not so much WHO. You mean the United Nations?
Sorry, yes. No, correct.
Yeah. We'll come back to WHO and the humanitarian side in a minute. The issue is this: the UN has got this dual role. The UN system, meaning the Secretary General and the big panoply of its agencies and programs. It's got a dual role. One role is the guardian of international norms and principles, the UN Charter, which tells you how nations are supposed to behave and how nations are supposed to behave towards each other and how they're supposed to behave in relation to their social contract with their own citizens, human rights, decency, and all freedoms of the UN Charter and the Human Rights Declaration as well, and so many other subsidiary norms that follow from that. So it's a keeper of those norms, and he's supposed to stand up for them. At the same time, when you have a highly conflicted situation like the one we're facing now, and we've faced previous rounds of this particular crisis many times over in the last 70-odd years, the UN is supposed to be neutral, because the UN is neutral in the sense that it's supposed to be impartial, but not because both sides are equally right or wrong. Impartiality does not mean that both sides have an equally right or wrong case, but impartiality is simply an attribute that allows the mediator to use their good offices to negotiate between two conflicting parties and have the confidence of both conflicting parties to come to an accommodation. And if you look at the history of past UN Secretary Generals, a long line going back since its foundation in the 1940s, you see that in the past, you had, when there were wars and conflicts all over the world turned to this UN Secretary General to go help knock heads together, say words to each side, sometimes always in private, but generally to win their trust and confidence, which he had by virtue of the position he occupied. And then his moral, I say he because it's all been men so far, his moral authority would shame the warring parties together to come together. And we've seen this in many conflicts in the past, in the good old days. But today, we have the UN is under pressure. On one hand, it's told to stand up and say and condemn things when bad things happen, the war on Ukraine or killing of civilians in Gaza. And this Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who is not known as a man who kind of takes a position on many things, except he started doing that in his once he won his second term in office, and he therefore didn't have to worry about getting votes for his re-election. Then he became suddenly very outspoken, and his remarks at the Security Council meeting recently, where he spoke that what was happening in Gaza wasn't happening in a vacuum, and this was misunderstood by people. In my opinion, justifiably misunderstood by people to imply that he's excusing the Hamas bombing. He wasn't meaning to do that, but his speechwriter who wrote those particular words was either an idiot or was completely tone deaf on the case, because that's what it appears. So you would have thought that the UN Secretary General would be called down and keep his own counsels while he try and find an accommodation and a peaceful settlement. But instead, by him grandstanding in front of the world's media and condemning not just what was going on in terms of the suffering of civilians, that's perfectly fine, but to do that implying taking sides, even though I don't think he meant to, but that was the ham-handed way in which he spoke. It immediately meant a number of things. Yeah. It neutralized and marginalized the UN, and it means that the UN humanitarian side is also been marginalized. And secondly, it has meant that no one is expecting the UN to actually have any political role in this thing. You see Anthony Blinken going down, this is a second visit, and you've seen the US president come down, and he doesn't travel very often to such things, at first call. And you've seen foreign ministers and prime ministers, even the French president, everyone's been down to the Middle East, and they're still coming, right? And all the Arab states and so on and so forth. It is not even mentioned in all this. So the UN, which was formed in the aftermath of the Second World War, with all the troubles that you know about, and the Holocaust, incidentally, which led to the creation of Israel, amongst other things, is now completely being marginalized in this process. And I think that's a very bad idea. So the peace is then dependent on polarized member states. And you can imagine that the polarized views of member states from the different perspectives are going to be very, very difficult to accommodate. So in the end, I think peace will come not by a compromise being reached on principles, but it'll come by whoever has the upper hand when this conflict finishes. And then perhaps wiser people will come in and try to build on that to see if we can have peace. One of the lessons of history that I've learned in 30, 40 years of going to war zones, all wars only end when one side or other has won. And when, or they've come to a complete standstill, meaning they're both lost, right? Usually what usually used to happen historically was somebody won and somebody lost. And then if the winner was wise, they kind of treated the loser with magnanimity, and you kind of, you didn't rub the nose in it, and you kind of made friends again, kissed and made up, went on. But as the years have gone, more and more wars are not necessarily ending in victory and loss, but victory and defeat. They're ending in stalemate. But even in the stalemate, one side is usually the more superior side in this. And then that means that you never have a complete peace, if you wish, you see. And that's why you see many, many wars and conflicts around the world. They will go up, they will fire up and dampen down, and they will then rise again, and they'll come down again with environmental factors acting on them according to whichever is triggering them. So this explains, I think, partly why the situation in the Middle East is in such a chronic, repetitive cycle of violence, calm down, violence, and calm down, apart from the stupidity of some of the leaderships that have been involved at different stages of the last several decades.
So far, we have looked at the conflicts or the Middle East really in secular terms. Having said that, I got the feeling that we are seeing again a far more religious undercurrent being injected, being infiltrated, therefore making it so much harder when it comes not just to the point of one side winning, but actually really with the aim of some Arab voices saying they want to eradicate Israel once and for all and get rid of the Jews. Is that just something that that maybe has been picked up and maybe falsely blown out of proportion? Or have you seen that in your own experience as well?
Well, I think certainly as far as Hezbollah and Hamas are concerned, they have what we can only call a genocidal approach. The definition of a genocide is the intent and often an attempted practice to try and eradicate a group of people on account of their identity. And that identity may be a social identity, a cultural identity, and very definitely a religious identity. And often it's mixed up. And this is, of course, what happened in the Holocaust. Right now, it's well known that the ideology of Hamas, Hezbollah, and their supporters is the eradication of Israel, and because Israel is majority Jewish, that means the eradication of the Jewish people. And eradication in this context doesn't necessarily mean that every single Jew has to be killed, which is what the Germans tried, or the Nazis tried in those days. But to get them out of the way. And today, genocides are committed, as we know from Cambodia, as we know from Rwanda, as we know from Darfur, and all of which I've been involved in, and also in Tigray region of Ethiopia, or with the Yazidis in Iraq. The idea is to eradicate a culture as much as to destroy the human beings, because the idea is more important than the human being. People regenerate, but once an idea is dead, it's dead. So the ideology of these fundamentalists, Hamas and Hezbollah, is very definitely genocidal in mindset. Now, they will justify that on the grounds of their historic grievances and all the rest of it, but I think it's more than that. Now, coming from the other side, there are a number of people claiming that what Israel is doing in Gaza with its extremely destructive, no-holds-bar warfare, heavy bombing, literally block by block, and no quarters spared, approach, so it's claimed, is also genocidal. Well, I don't think it is. I think many people are saying that Israel is committing genocide. I think they're misusing the word genocide, because I've not heard Israel say that it wants to eliminate the Palestinian people. It says it wants to eliminate the military structure and the political structure of Hamas. But that is not the same thing as eliminating the Palestinian people. So, but of course, you see, the word genocide has come to mean, well, it's a very emotional term, and it's come to have a popular meaning, which is, so you see this, I was seeing the banners in these demonstrations I saw on TV, Israel committing genocide, etc., you see. And this just reflects both the misinformation as well as the disinformation that is going around the place. But to be honest, we know people are suffering. We know thousands have been killed in Gaza. We know that nearly everyone is displaced in Gaza, close on to 2 million people. It's moot comfort to anybody, whether in Israel or in Gaza, to figure out whether if they're killed or if they are displaced, whether it's due to genocide or due to lesser crime.
Absolutely.
It is in a fairly academic and legal viewpoint, which is not practically very useful for well-being and survival of people on the ground of either side.
Well, you're so right. You're so right. There are so many factors influencing what we hear as consumers or as humans outside of the Middle East. It's always so difficult to look at media and first figure out, is it true what I've been told? And then the second question is, why am I being told that particular piece of information? So there is very much a warfare going on, as you have alluded to, in the media as well. And unfortunately, that is, the bigger the gore, if it bleeds, it leads. That was always the factor for selling news, and that has not changed. So it's very, very hard, really, for people to make up their mind. And I have to get informed properly, and therefore have a balanced point of view. The other thing to say is that the education of our children has gone down the drain big time, certainly when it comes to history, and certainly when it comes to getting to know the real history, not just what is written somewhere in a bloody textbook. And therefore, you have got nowadays a situation that is a world that is dominated by social media. And by misinformation, disinformation, as you have alluded to, and some very shadowy players. Hell, how can we possibly make this world a better place if there's so much going on that is actually working against our attempts to improve the world? Why have you not given up in your work? Why have you not said, you know what, I become a gardener? This is all so hopeless and helpless. Is there hope?
Well, apart from the fact that I'm a hopeless gardener, and anything I touch shrivels away. But it's a serious question you ask. I think it's because, people like you and I who inhabit comfortable spaces and who have the luxury of opting in and out of people's misfortunes and suffering, and partly in a voyeuristic manner. And even if you are an actor, as I have been in my field career, I could always go home.
Exactly.
So it was optional. And let me answer by just sharing with you an anecdote, really, about someone I met, not in this context, but in another place in Sudan, when I was doing some work there in terms of drawing attention to atrocities going on in the Nuba Mountains, the border between Sudan and South Sudan. And when I interviewed this lady, and she said, and I had cameras with me, and she said, tell your cameraman to come closer and take my photo, and tell the world, and you, I know you will, thanks for coming, you are here, but I know you'll be gone this afternoon, and we're still going to be here. But I want you to do something for me. I've been raped many times, and I'm not ashamed. I want you to tell people my name, show them my face, and tell them my story. Because my greatest fear is, she said, that I am born here, I'm raped here, I'm abused here, tortured here, and I will die here, and nobody will know. So what is the point of me being here?
Wow.
That taught me a number of things. One was that those of us who live in safe spaces thousands of miles away have the luxury of feeling sympathetic and compassionate. And then we can have the luxury also at the same time of feeling depressed. But when you are at the front line, when you're if you like, the survivor or the victim in these cases, you don't have the luxury of feeling anything other than courageous and strong, and in order to survive. So that really made me think that if this lady was facing the future with a degree of rebelliousness and fortitude, then I had no right to feel pessimistic because, how could I be? So in a way, that really has equipped me to be to always remain optimistic. Optimistic doesn't mean being naive or upbeat, but simply saying that if these people don't give up, doesn't matter where they are, whether they're in Gaza or Israel or Ukraine or Sudan, or if they're not giving up, what right have I to give up?
What a beautiful.
That's why I keep going. That's why I keep on raising my voice. That's why I keep on ranting and raving if that's what I have to do, and try to convince or argue or whatever it is I have to do.
Wow, that is the most beautiful statement I could imagine. Because it is so easy to give up, but if we have got a moral duty to speak out. And because that is often the only thing that we can do in the face of adversity, especially in such a multifactorial craziness, such as the Middle East, but also Ukraine and many other conflicts and disaster situations. You might not be able to influence something, but you have got the choice and the privilege to speak out, raise awareness, and be there as a witness and someone who speaks out. I think that we saw it in Germany. There was in with the Nazis. That was a nice saying. First, they came for the communists, and I didn't say anything because I'm not a communist. Then they came for the etc. And he goes through a number of groups. And when he finally came to him, there was no one left to speak out. And that is something that it is our duty. That's why I approached you so much to actually come onto my show, that we two can have this discussion and maybe just open the eyes of some of our viewers who might have not had the insight into the Middle East, maybe the way that you have experienced it over the decades now. And you were quite right earlier on saying, I was of course referring to the UN as the kind of world police, maybe to go in there, and we discussed that. And we already said it's not so easy. So the police will not come anytime soon. But I mean, now we are left with 2 million people displaced. I mean, we are talking about 10,000 people thereabouts dead. Now, a factor of 10, 20 would be the injured people that we are seeing there. That is a humanitarian catastrophe. What can the world do? What is the role of the WHO? What is the role of other humanitarian institutions? I mean, you have been there on the cold face. What is there anything that can be done right now? When will people get access again to the wounded and displaced?
Well, first to say that this war's been going on for what, 3 weeks, a month, what's remarkable is how much the humanitarian agencies that have been present on the ground have been doing. Because remember, no aid has been getting through until very recently, and now only a trickle. So the UN agencies, WHO, UNICEF, and the Red Cross, Red Crescent system, Médecins Sans Frontières, and many other humanitarian organizations have been eking out the resources that were available there in Gaza and patching people up in the hospitals, supplying food and wherever there was food, water, and providing shelter in the different schools which UNRWA is running. So I think it's remarkable how much humanitarians have been doing. And by the way, don't forget that most of the humanitarian agencies of the UN and the Red Cross systems we're talking about, most of the staff are locals. So we're not here talking about hordes of foreigners going in. Most of the help being provided has been by the local staff of these very organizations. So these humanitarian workers have been carrying the same risks as the host population. And in fact, scores of them have also died in the line of duty. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that here I am going to say something slightly controversial, and that is 10,000 people have died, considering the extent of damage and destruction, devastation. Now, I wouldn't want more to die, or I wouldn't want to say that 10,000 is too little or too many. But the fact is, if you just think about it, with the bombings that are going on and the total destruction of the system, it's a miracle that more have not been killed. And that actually points to two things. One, despite all the kind of hysteria that's going on in terms of war crimes and indiscriminate violence, actually, if it really was completely indiscriminate, we'd have many more people dead at this time. And maybe there are. I mean, the other thing is the statistics. Who's counting
exactly.
And who is to? And I'm sure the 10,000 is an underestimate. So you realize it's a little bit of a complex situation there. And
I think that just a quick note here. I mean, first of all, if you level a complete apartment block, there will be many bodies that will not be recovered. And it is such a densely populated area, for crying out loud. Whilst traditionally the statistics coming from the PLO and from Lebanon were actually not too inflated. They were deemed quite realistic assessments. In such a conflict, my goodness, I mean, who knows what the real number is? It is likely much higher. That needs to be said here.
And then on the counter side is there's resilience of the people.
Yeah.
Because remember, these people have got PhDs in survival. They have been through previous cycles of violence.
That's true.
And I'm afraid that has equipped them to find ways of coping and surviving. This is not to glorify anything, but simply to say, and that's why somebody asked me the other day whether I believed in miracles. And it wasn't a religious question, though it could be interpreted in a religious way. But I said, well, I think anytime anybody survives and a new baby is born in the rubble, which in fact has been happening, even twins have been born in the rubble, it's a miracle. So let's not forget that. But coming back to your question about what can we do on this. Well, I'm not sure that ceasefires are the answer. See, now that the war has started, for better or for worse, you don't want to go down the route of a half-won, half-lost war, because just prolongs the agony. And we've seen that in many, many other situations where, for example, I'm just thinking now of Bosnia, where there was this terrible conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and after huge international pressure, it was frozen through international initiatives, and it remains frozen to this day. So we may not have hot violence going on, but we don't have a solution to the conflict, and this has been now 20 odd years later. So I think the best of all wars is a fast, furious, and brief war. So this is not, I don't want to be misunderstood here to say that I am an advocate of a relentless war. But I think what Israel is doing is the strategy of going in fast and furious and trying to get this over and done with as fast as possible is in the long run the more humanitarian strategy, even though critics would round on me and say, hang on, what are you talking here about? Look at the suffering, look at the displacement. I get it. This is a dilemma. There is no good way of fighting an urban war.
Exactly.
The best of all bad ways of fighting a war is for it to be intense and short. That's why I am against ceasefires. I am, however, in favor of these humanitarian pauses that some leaders have called for. And those humanitarian pauses, which will last for hours at a time, gives you enough time to get the injured out, aid in, and to mitigate some of the suffering. And it can't be more than a few hours at a time, because otherwise I think this would be give the fighters time to rest and then prepare for the next round, which exactly. I have also seen in conflicts elsewhere. So, this is one of the problems of humanitarians and their blind spot. And people are disappointed when I speak like this, because they think as a humanitarian, I should be advocating for kind of laying down your arms, having a ceasefire, and kind of go back to helping people. Well, I think to help the suffering people, I think it's better to get on with this war and finish it as fast as possible to eliminate Hamas. And then to give proper aid to people and think of the future. Meanwhile, I think Israel should provide these breathing spaces, at least enough, so that some of the innocent civilians, and most of the people in Gaza are innocent civilians, get some relief and are evacuated. Speaking of which, I don't see many nations. Everybody is worried about displacement in Gaza, but I don't see any nation, especially not the Arab nations, opening the doors to let the Gazans in.
Exactly. You could argue, why the hell is Egypt not opening up its border? Exactly.
On the ground, what they're saying is that on the ground, that if they do that, this would be tantamount to helping Israel to do ethnic cleansing, i.e., remove all the Gazans, and they will never go back, and then you will have a mini Gaza re-established in the Sinai, and then it's a repeat of the Nakba in 1948. So that's their argument, if you like. But we also know that the Hamas, which is derived from Muslim Brotherhood, and they caused havoc in Egypt and had to be outlawed. And Gulf states, they are not keen on having too many Palestinians amidst themselves because of the threat to their security. In the same way that it has brought insecurity to Israel, it has also brought insecurity to other countries. And I'm just sorry for Palestinians, because obviously it's not the fault of millions of Palestinians. Most Palestinians are perfectly ordinary people like, I hope, you and I. But the fact is that their particular situation has led them into a particularly complex positioning vis-a-vis their neighborhoods, which makes them unwanted in many, many places around the world. And it just reminds me of the Jews of Europe in history. Because
you are just, oh my God, as if you could read my mind. I was about to draw this parallel, because, the European nations and the United States, what did they take? Half a dozen here, half a dozen there Jews at a time when it was absolutely blatantly obvious that the genocide was occurring. So you're so right. This is not something new, is it?
So these two Semite people, both the Jews and the Palestinians, of the Arabs, they are in this kind of mutual dance, or they're the two sides of the same coin in terms of the historical experiences, if you go back far enough. And that, I think, is the eternal tragedy of this place. Now, everybody talks about two-state solutions as because that's what the General Assembly agreed eons ago. And as time has gone, the two-state solution has not been put into practice for different reasons. Israel has nibbled away at what would have been Palestine, and meanwhile the Palestinians bear grudges, and Israel has its security issues. I mean, the ideal solution, but I don't know why nobody talks about this so much, is why not return to the old historic Palestine, much bigger Palestine, within the current boundaries of what is Israel, where it's a unitary state where both the Jews and the Arabs live together as one state solution. Now, of course, it's ideal, and it's not going to happen. People are going to say, but the two-state solution is also a form of apartheid. I mean, people accuse Israel of being a colonialist apartheid state, and there is some reason to think like that. At least on prima facie grounds, in the way they treat Palestinians in the West Bank and even in Gaza, and obviously the walls they have built, and to keep people and their settlements apart is a form of apartheid. Well, a two-state solution is also apartheid, because these will be two different peoples. Of course, they're the same blood, but dwelling next to each other. Let's see geography of that looks like, if that's not clear. And if that isn't a form of apartheid, I don't know what it is. Now, in South Africa, they tried apartheid. You had black groups here and there. You had this homeland for the blacks around South Africa. And in the end, they fell apart. And today you have a South Africa where blacks and whites live together. They rub along and they grumble and fight and quarrel and so on and so forth. But this is going to go on for some time. But we have one South Africa. And by and large, the rainbow nation of South Africa has done well since apartheid broke down. But I do not think that the formulas being offered nowadays, whether formula of a two-state solution, and some are even now saying three-state solutions, Gaza its own state, after the war ends, are necessarily going to bring us peace ahead. But then I think it's going to need some really special leadership on all sides to come to whatever the answer is going to be in the years to come.
Wow. Very well said. It's so hard to come up with a solution or even a way forward. The only thing that we really can hope for is ultimately, I like what you said, a very fierce, short conflict, so that the conflict and the fighting can be put aside and humanitarian aid can get back in, and actually the sides, whatever sides are left, can come to the table and actually agree on at least meeting again and stepping forward rather than fighting. Having said that, bloody hell, now that let's say Israel is successful, however you define success here, that Hamas is somehow obliterated. Is there not then a vacuum? Is that not then something that we have seen in Iraq, where suddenly you wipe out all the bad boys and take them away, and then suddenly there are more bad boys left, which then turn into ISIS, because the whole Ba'ath party has been dissolved. What will happen?
No. Yes and no. In that nature abhors a vacuum, we know that. And then, but what happened in the case of Iraq was that the war was won very quickly against Saddam Hussein, remarkably quickly. So you would expect with the world superpowers against that country, that regime. But the immediate aftermath was extremely badly handled.
Exactly.
So, in other words, America in particular is to blame for this because they didn't want the mission creep of trying to pick pieces, and picking up the pieces goes with the job. So, if you're going to break it, you're supposed to put it together again.
Which they not did very well, did they? No.
which one they were not reluctant to do, and when they did, it was half-hearted. Now, I can imagine a different context. One in Gaza, it's a much smaller place, much fewer people, and even if it's obliterated, and this is a horrible thing to say, I mean, in physical terms, and a couple of million people hopefully have to live, etc. But I can see some kind of international authority which the world contributes to, not led by the United States or any of the people supporting, providing weaponry to Israel, because I don't think they would have the confidence. They would have the confidence of the population, but certainly be led by the UN. It could be the Arab states. It could be third parties. A technical authority, if you like, you see, not a political authority, that begins a process of clearing the rubble and trying to find some kind of basic life for people there, to get over their immediate trauma, to rebuild their strength as much as you can, and find a breather so that they can decide what they wish to do in the future. Now, what the future is, it'll have to be decided by the 2 million people. And it'll require some kind of popular process to do that, making sure that some things are off the cards. That is, no extremists can occupy any leadership position. So I remember being in East Timor. The Indonesians did terrible things in their province of East Timor, and terrible things indeed. And then there was a UN administration that was installed, and the UN administration, and I was there, job was basically the restoration of public services, water, food, electricity, shelter, and so on, to give the East Timorese just enough space of 4 or 5 years, I think, so that they could decide what they want to do. And now they're running their country in the usual imperfect way in which we run our countries wherever we are in the world. So it's possible to do that. Whether that Gaza Strip is part of independent Palestine, or whether it is some kind of a self-contained territory, time will tell. But personally, I think it's not too difficult to envisage some kind of international authority that cleans up the act and provides a breathing space and runs it in pure public administration terms, not in political terms, but simply to provide services and allow Palestinians, Gazans, to come up again.
Where should the money come from? Because,
it would have to be the international community, because if you take the view that it is the collective mismanagement of the international community over the last few years that broke the place. You can argue whether it's America's fault less and that person's fault more, or whether it's Iran's fault, or you can argue. But when it's all said and done, to restore some type of humanity to Gaza is a public good. We know that that an unstable, insecure Gaza is going to spawn wider insecurity for the region and for the world. So it's not collective good. We'll pay for it together. You'll pay for it through your taxpayer via the New Zealand government's contribution to the UN. I think it's not that it's going to be costly. But don't forget, the Palestinians are entrepreneurial people. They, where you are. Even now in the ruins, they're operating their small shops and businesses.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. You're quite right. Wow. Actually, you've given me so much beautiful information, and you have reframed some of the very complex issues in my that we are seeing there. In my mind, there is now actually, after our interview, far more hope for the place, and I see actually now a future. And I think that is where such wise leadership as your voice could do so much more. So we need to. I love it that you speak out. However, there's so many voices out there. Sometimes common sense and good voices get drowned out or pushed aside. There's too much other noise coming through. And do you see?
Well, a part of the thing, by the way, is change in Israel also. I think I don't know how the Israeli leadership is going to take this, but Israeli leadership in the last year or two or bit has been very conflicted.
Correct.
And so have the Israeli people. But I do know that there are many, many extremely sensible and concerned Israeli people. And they have to seize their own governance with both hands and say, hey, return to the status quo ante is not an option, because that's not going to take us forward. So I think it has to be some give and take on that side. And that also means that the Israeli diaspora abroad has to play a constructive role in this, as also has got to play the Palestinian diaspora. And they should not necessarily be in competition with each other in a tribalistic way. I mean, this is not a football match. I mean, I use that example because recently I was reading the news story that the football club, that the Jewish football club of Leeds refused to play the Arab football club of Leeds University. I mean, can you get so more idiotic than that? And that's what I mean, that the role of the diaspora and the public and the pressure it gives is actually quite malign in this.
Yeah.
And this is why I argued in a paper I wrote recently that the Geneva Conventions, which everyone thinks applies to soldiers on the ground and civilians on the ground, absolutely, they should. But in my view, those who egg on violence, or who take hateful positions in relation to some dispute, why should they be protected? And when they're as much warriors in today's digital warfare than the soldiers, at least the soldiers on the ground are fighting with their bodies. But those who sit behind computers sending tweets in a unconstructive manner or in distant manner, or they fire, or as in example I gave was in apartment blocks in Ukraine, directing drones. Then don't be surprised if somebody bombs your apartment block if the drone driver happens on the 5th floor of an apartment block from which the armed drones are being directed elsewhere. So this is a other problem in today's conflicts. We have all become warriors. Who is a civilian and who is not who is a fighter?
Yeah.
Those lines have become blurred, and it means that when you are in a faraway place and you're not actually fighting on the ground with a gun in your hand, but you're fighting with your ideas, with your voice, or with your opinions on whichever side, then I think you're involved. And if you're involved, then you are fair game in that warfare. that means, well, the logic of that takes you into horrible territory. And I'd rather not think about that, especially now with artificial intelligence and other technologies that are coming in, which means that our old Geneva Conventions, or the way we framed the conduct of wars, they are the rules of war. They are being heavily stretched at the present.
Well, I have not looked at it from that angle, but these are very wise words. These are very, very true words. Wow. But then again, it points to our own duty to speak out, to confront extremism and hate speech wherever we face it, and maybe model a different way of behaving. And we can all therefore become actors, so to speak, in that game, or in that lethal game, shall I say, that we have a role to play. Therefore, we're actually not powerless to sit on the sidelines and think, oh my God, the world is going belly up and I can't do anything. Yes, you can. Yes, you have got a role to play by countering the hateful voices out there, and by speaking out and by modeling a good behavior, a different behavior that maybe is more humane and more fitting for a human than actually the hateful stuff that we see out there happening.
Well, I think that is absolutely true. And the corollary of that is that in today's globalized contexts, where we are interdependent in little and large ways, there is no space for neutrality. As someone said, that if you're in a highway and you are in the middle of the highway, you'll get squashed by cars coming from both sides. If you just stand in the middle. And I think it was Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King, I can't remember, who said something like, there is a special place in hell for the neutral, when neutral people are confronted by all the wrongs that are going on in the world. So I think everyone in the world has to take sides.
Yeah.
And the only thing we hope is that it's a moral side, and it's a side that that defends the bigger principles. So if you're going to take a pro-Israel side or a pro-Palestinian side, that's fine. But if you take a pro-Israeli side, it should not be an anti-Palestinian side, if you see what I'm trying to say, or the other way around. You see, taking sides on grounds of principles of humanity and justice, which go together, is not the same thing as being partisan. In fact, you have to take sides, because if you don't take sides, then all you're doing is perpetuating a world in which inhumanity, unfairness, and injustice are going to prevail. So I see these struggles that are going on as very important for evolution, for our evolution as human beings, in a way. So, there are rebellions going on everywhere. There are people standing up in arms. There are people doing coups and counter coups. There are people, raging everywhere for whatever cause they believe in, etc. And I look upon all that, and I look at it and say, hey, that ferment of humanity, even though some of them are extremely evil or misinformed, but it's my opinion, and others will have their own opinion, but that is an important part of an evolution towards something.
Yeah.
And so this is not an argument for perpetual revolution or have deliberate revolution in order to have something emerge from it. But what I'm saying is that the fact that we have conflicts in many countries in the world, we have people blocking roads because of climate change, because governments are not doing enough for it, or somebody else agitating because they're not getting their COVID vaccination against, all these disputes that are taking place all over the world on all sorts of topics. They have forms of conflict, if not necessarily always armed conflict, hopefully, or not always armed conflict. But they are part of a growing, the only place where you maybe don't have such conflicts openly is probably totalitarian regimes like Eritrea and China. And for the life of me, I don't want to live in countries like that. And I see this great battle that's taking place, if you like, almost like a third world war. It's not a third world war of warfare in that sense, but it's a war for freedom. It's a war for freedoms, if you wish. It's a muddled war. It's a confused war. It's expressed in different ways. Some are wars of self-determination. Some are wars against marginalization. Others are wars of equal treatment. And all sorts of things are there. Ultimately, there are wars about forms of freedom. So in that sense, maybe this is the third world war. But the nature of that war is very different. And probably the necessary phase we have to go through on this planet before we emerge a more sane society. But that will be after I leave the planet, probably.
Oh, you're quite right. I love that more philosophical end here of our discussion. It is, but then again, it shows that we have got the power to do something by taking a stance, by speaking out, by behaving in a certain way. Does no longer make us a victim of circumstances, but you become a survivor by actually taking action, and even a thriver in the sense of post-traumatic growth and reframing circumstances or reframing trauma that you have experienced, and now becoming a stronger, different human being in response to that. So I think there is hope out there. I think that is the one thing that I take away from our discussion today. Mukesh, you're an amazing man. I love to talk to you. I could talk to you for many hours, and I hope that we have been able to at least shine a different spotlights into the Israel-Hamas conflict as it is right now, and hope soon that the whole thing is resolved one way or the other, and that humanitarian aid can get to those that need it, and the world can get on with addressing the things that are important. Mukesh, you're an amazing man. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.
As always. And you guys out there, look after yourself. Bye.
And you. Bye. Bye. Bye.
I never give up. I never give up. I never give up. Trying